So if you go back to the early 1990s, China recognized that pretty much every other country that had gotten rich had done so in large part by building up an automotive industry that then served as a mechanism for creating innovations in other sectors. You look at the US, you look at Germany, you look at Japan, you look even at Korea, which is very successful. So they said, okay, we have to have a big auto industry. This is one of the key industries that we have to support. So starting in the early 1990s, they had this strategy of bringing in foreign companies, making them do joint ventures on a 50-50 basis with Chinese auto companies. And the theory was that eventually the Chinese companies would learn, and then you would be able to, develop your own national champion auto companies and, kick the foreigners out, right? And basically this failed. It failed massively. Over the next 25 years, foreign companies came in, General Motors, VW, Toyota, Honda, and so forth. And they did very, very well. And the joint venture partners in China basically just sat around and clipped coupons from the dividends that these joint ventures were producing. All of the technological inputs continuously came from the foreign partners. All of the design ideas, that the local partners just were never able to succeed. And in volume terms, you had a lot of smaller scale, locally sponsored vehicle companies in China building kind of low-end vehicles. So a lot of the cars that wound up getting made in China were made by local firms. But if you look at the share of profits and total value in the system, it was dominated by these joint ventures, which were in turn dominated by the foreign partners. So China, circa 2010, 2015, had been doing this for 25 years, and they were basically no closer to having globally competitive conventional car makers than they had been 25 years before. So in the late 2000s, so 2005, 2010, they started thinking, well, this and other related kind of industrial policies are not working very well. We are not generating the national champions that we thought that we were going to do. So what do we do about this? And their answer was leapfrog. Let's try and figure out what is the next stage of technological development that people really aren't working on yet. Let's work on that, and then maybe we can get in on the ground floor. And so what they came up with, in large measure, was renewable energy, specifically electric vehicles. So they started having a pretty comprehensive set of subsidies and other kinds of industrial support for companies like BYD to produce electric vehicles. BYD is basically a private company. Right. This worked okay for 10 or 12 years, and BYD got pretty good. And particularly what they started to figure out was the supply chain. So they got very good at making the batteries. But still, when you got to 2018, 2019, BYD was still not that exciting a company. Most people in China really didn't want to buy electric vehicles. They seemed really inconvenient. The sexy cars were like the big SUVs that the joint ventures were putting out and so forth. And then in 2018, the Chinese government made the decision that they would allow Tesla to come in and build a wholly owned gigafactory in Shanghai. They had never approved a wholly owned automotive company before. They started cranking out cars in 2019, which became immensely popular. And it seems like one of the things that happened was that the Chinese companies by 2019 had gotten pretty good at the underlying technology of electric cars, specifically the batteries and then the software systems that govern the cars. But they were terrible at consumer design. They had not figured out how to make these appealing products that people would want to buy. And Tesla did have appealing products that people wanted to buy. They were big status symbols. So BYD and its competitors said, okay, this is the part we have to figure out. How do we achieve this? And basically, they recognized that they had to up their design game. They, among other things, went to Germany and loaded up on a lot of German car designers that were able to transform their kind of technology base into much more appealing packages. And then by 2022 or so, they were, able to compete with Tesla both on price and on quality. So, I think what that shows you is that, number one, the Chinese government made a pretty good bet on this kind of leapfrogging idea that there are technologies of the future. We need to get in early, subsidize the heck out of them. Some of the estimates that have been made about the level of subsidies given to the EV industry and related supply chains, it's $200 or $300 billion, huge, huge amounts of money that did not generate that much of a return, financial return, for a really long time. But they stuck at it. And then the thing that finally flipped the switch was this catalytic foreign investment that showed the Chinese companies what they needed to do to actually compete in the consumer market. And then they got very good at that very quickly.
How much was the $200-300 billion actually relevant, given the fact that BYD, as you mentioned, is a private company?
Yep.
Was that all, how much of that was actually necessary or counterfactually important to creating this outcome?
I think the thing is, it's like the old slogan about advertising: half of it works, but you don't know which half. Mm-hmm. Yeah, did China need to spend that much in subsidies? Probably not, right? But had they spent less, would they have had the same effect? Maybe, maybe not. They tried various different types of subsidies. So initially there were producer subsidies to just get companies to produce more. Then they had a lot of buyer subsidies. So at the individual level, but also the city government level to promote, things like electric buses. And so I think all of that played a role. And I think what was important was that the government set a very clear direction. And they said, we want this to happen. And we really want it. And we don't know how long it's going to take. And we're just going to keep trying different things until it works, because the goal of creating this electric vehicle sector and the whole supply chain for it, that's what we want at the end.
If you enjoyed this clip, you can watch the full episode here and subscribe for more clips. Thanks.